Accompanied by the disciples, he left the upstairs room and went as usual to the Mount of Olives. There he told them, "Pray God that you will not be overcome by temptation." He walked away, perhaps a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed this prayer. "Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of horror from me, but I want your will, not mine." Then an angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him, for he was in such agony of spirit that he broke into a sweat of blood with great drops falling to the ground as he prayed more and more earnestly. At last he stood up again and returned to the disciples, only to find them asleep, exhausted from grief. "Asleep," he said. "Get up. Pray God that you will not fall when you are tempted." But even as he said this, a mob approached, led by Judas, one of his 12 disciples. Judas walked over to Jesus and kissed him on the cheek in a friendly greeting. But Jesus said, "Judas, how can you do this? Betray the Messiah with a kiss." When the disciples saw what was about to happen, they exclaimed, "Master, shall we fight?" We brought along the swords, and one of them slashed at the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "Don't resist anymore," and he touched the place where the man's ear had been and restored it. When Jesus addressed the chief priests and captains of the temple guards and the religious leaders who headed the mob, "Am I a robber," he asked, "that you have come armed with swords and clubs to get me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there every day." But this is your moment, the time when Satan's power reigns supreme. So they seized him and led him to the high priest's residence, and Peter followed at a distance. The soldiers lit a fire in the courtyard and sat around it for warmth, and Peter joined them there. A servant girl noticed him in the firelight and began staring at him. Finally she spoke. "This man was with Jesus." Peter denied it. "Woman," he said, "I don't even know the man." After a while, someone else looked at him and said, "You must be one of them." "No, sir, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, someone else flatly stated, "I know this fellow is one of Jesus' disciples, for both are from Galilee." But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And as he said the words, a rooster crowed. At that moment, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered what he had said. "Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter walked out of the courtyard, crying bitterly. Now the guards in charge of Jesus began mocking him. They blindfolded him and hit him with their fists and asked, "Who hit you that time, prophet?" And they threw all sorts of other insults at him. Early the next morning at daybreak, the Jewish Supreme Court assembled, including the chief priest and all the top religious authorities of the nation. Jesus was led before this council and instructed to state whether or not he claimed to be the Messiah. But he replied, "If I tell you, you won't believe me or let me present my case. But the time is soon coming when I, the Messiah, shall be enthroned beside the Almighty God." They all shouted, "Then you claim you are the Son of God?" And he replied, "Yes, I am. What need do we have for other witnesses? For we ourselves have heard him say it." The entire council took Jesus over to Pilate, the governor. They began at once accusing him. "This fellow has been leading our people to ruin by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is our Messiah, a king." Pilate turned to the chief priest and to the mob and said, "So, that isn't a crime." Then they became desperate. But he is causing riots against the government everywhere he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem. "Is he then a Galilean?" Pilate asked. When he told them yes, Pilate said to take him to King Herod, for Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus, for he had heard a lot about him and had been hoping to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but there was no reply. Meanwhile, the chief priest and other religious leaders stood there shouting their accusations. Now Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus and putting a kingly robe on him. They sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate, enemies before, became fast friends. Then Pilate called together the chief priest and other Jewish leaders, along with the people, and announced his verdict. "You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt against the Roman government. I have examined him thoroughly on this point and find him to be innocent." Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. "Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. I will therefore have him scourged with leaded thongs and release him." But now a mighty roar rose from the crowd, as with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Barabbas was in prison for starting an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. Pilate argued with them, for he wanted to release Jesus. But they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Once more, for a third time, he demanded, "Why? What crime has he committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death. I will therefore scourge him and let him go." But they shouted louder and louder for Jesus' death, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they demanded, and he released Barabbas, the man in prison for insurrection and murder, at their request. But he delivered Jesus over to them to do with as they would. As the crowd led Jesus away to his death, Simon of Cyrene, who was just coming to Jerusalem from the country, was forced to follow, carrying Jesus' cross. Great crowds trailed along behind, and many grief-stricken women. But Jesus said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming when women who have no children will be counted fortunate indeed. Mankind will beg the mountains to fall on them. For if such things as this are done to me, the living tree, what will they do to you?" 2 other criminals were led out to be executed with him at a place called the Skull. There all 3 were crucified. Jesus on the center cross and the 2 other criminals on either side. "Father, forgive these people," Jesus said, "for they don't know what they are doing." And the soldiers gambled for his clothing, throwing dice for each piece. The crowd watched, and the Jewish leaders laughed and scoffed. "He was so good at helping others," they said. "Let's see him save himself if he is really God's chosen one, the Messiah." The soldiers mocked him too by offering him a drink of sour wine. And they called to him, "If you are king of the Jews, save yourself." A signboard was nailed to the cross above him with these words, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging beside him scoffed, "So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself, and us too while you're at it." But the other criminal protested, "Don't you even fear God when you are dying? We deserve to die for our evil deeds, but this man hasn't done one thing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Today you will be with me in paradise. This is a solemn promise." But now it was noon, and darkness fell across the whole land for 3 hours, until 3 o'clock. The light from the sun was gone, and suddenly the thick veil hanging in the temple split apart. Then Jesus shouted, "Father, I commit my spirit to you." And with those words, he died. When the captain of the Roman military unit handling the execution saw what had happened, he was stricken with awe before God and said, "Surely this man was innocent." And when the crowd that had come to see the crucifixion saw that Jesus was dead, they went home in deep sorrow. Meanwhile, Jesus' friends, including the women who had followed him down to Galilee, stood in the distance watching, and laid it in a new, unused tomb. This was done late on Friday afternoon, the day of preparation for the Sabbath. As the body was taken away, the women from Galilee followed and carried it into the tomb. They went home and prepared spices and ointments to embalm him. But by the time they were finished, it was the Sabbath, so they all rested all that day, as it was required by Jewish law.